Let's watch these bees going in and out for a minute. You'll notice the colour of these bees, they're quite orangey in colour. There are many different strains of bees. They all interbreed, it's a bit like breeds of sheep and cattle. But in recent years, many imported queens have been brought into the country, mostly from Italian strains. And these tend to be orangey in colour, and they're good-tempered and prolific. And for a long time they were thought to be the best thing you could have in bees. But in recent years attitudes have changed somewhat. This is the next door hive, and you can see that the bees are much darker in colour. The native British bee was almost entirely black, and there's an effort now to try and revive the native British breed. There's probably very few purebred ones around because of years of interbreeding with imported queens. The advantages of native bee, for one thing, you're not importing diseases and parasites when you stick to what's around you. They tend to survive better in the winter, they're hardier. One of the disadvantages is they do tend to be a little bit more bad-tempered. Another thing is that if you buy an imported queen, in the first couple of years your bees will probably be very nice, very well behaved, very easy to handle. But once they start crossing with the native bee, they tend to become quite bad-tempered, sometimes even worse than the native bee itself. Right, a word or two about gloves. In my last video I was wearing leather gloves with gauntlets. This time I'm wearing rubber gloves. When you wear rubber gloves, it's a good idea to use these muffs, because if the bees go for anywhere, it's the gap between your gloves and your bee suit. I'm also wearing a fully ventilated bee suit, and these are much more pleasant to use, particularly in hot weather, than the traditional bee suit. There's a saying in beekeeping that if you ask 3 beekeepers a question, you'll get at least 4 different answers. And the same thing applies to equipment, particularly gloves. If you look online, you'll find a lot of videos of people not wearing gloves at all, particularly from United States. But you have to remember that in the United States, virtually all their bees are imported. They're of Italian or possibly another group called Carniolan strains. These bees are very good tempered. You can handle them without gloves, and but the problem is they have to keep replacing the queens. A lot of American beekeepers replace their queens every year, so they always have nice, good-tempered bees. In this country, unless you keep replacing your queens every year, you're going to end up with something like my mongrel bees. And although they're not too bad, I wouldn't like to handle them without gloves. I have seen British beekeepers doing the bees without gloves. On both occasions when I watched this, they got stung. So my personal feeling is that unless you know your bees thoroughly, then you need gloves of some sort. As to whether they're leather or rubber gloves are more hygienic. They can be changed between apiaries or even between hives. They can be cleaned fairly easily, but they are very uncomfortable in hot weather. I much prefer leather gloves. They're cooler. The disadvantages of leather gloves is that you don't get quite the same sense of touch when you're handling the frames and so on as you do with no gloves or with rubber gloves. And also they tend to get dirty quite quickly, so you do need to replace them fairly often. But you can buy good leather gloves now for about £7 on the internet, and it's almost as cheap as buying a few pairs of rubber gloves. So you take your choice basically. Okay, let's have another look at this hive. One of the first things I'm doing is examining the what's called the Varroa board, which is a board underneath the hive. There's a mesh floor which allows debris and Varroa mites to fall through, and by looking at what's on the Varroa board you can get a good idea about what's going on in the hive. There's a lot of debris on this, I hope you can see it. In the middle there you've got a wax moth, and these can cause quite a lot of damage to the combs, so I was going to squash it but it's got away. You've got a lot of earwigs, they won't do any harm. A lot of this is debris from combs that have been opened by the bees. This is wax moth trails. Yes, that's inside some of these. There will be little grubs belonging to wax moths. There's one there, wax moth larva, and these can cause quite a lot of damage. I tend to find if the colony is strong, they don't cause too much trouble, but they can cause havoc, particularly in stored combs during the winter. So we'll clean that off. I was looking for Varroa mites. I couldn't actually see any on here. If we see some, I will show them to you. Right, this colony is on what we call brood and a half, and that the brood chamber consists of the brood box plus a super. This was because early on in the season these bees were doing particularly well, and they were building up to the extent that they completely filled the bottom brood box, and if we didn't do something about it they would probably swarm. So I increased the space in the brood box to allow them to continue, and you'll see that some of these brood frames, super frames rather, have got brood on them. I'm just checking to see if there's any queen cells on here. You'll notice, compared with the previous hive I looked at, that these bees are much more lively. They run around a lot more. We describe it as running. They're not so calm on the comb, but at the moment they're not trying to sting me through the gloves or anything, so it's more of a nuisance than anything else, the running about. When I looked at this hive about 10 days ago, there appeared to be a queen in it because there were eggs, but there were also a couple of queen cells. One of them was a sealed queen cell, so I left it. Now this could mean that the bees are what we call superseding, in other words they're going to replace the old queen without actually swarming, or it could simply mean that they were thinking about producing a new queen, but maybe they wouldn't actually do it. So I did actually mark the frame with the queen cell on it. Here it is. I marked it with a red drawing pin, and on this one there was a queen cell. You can now see the remains of that queen cell just here. It appears to have been torn down. In other words, if it had hatched, the end of the queen cell would be open, but there is simply a big hole in the side of the queen cell. So that suggests to me that the workers have destroyed this cell and have decided not to replace the queen. I know the old queen is here because there are eggs present in the hive, so this is the sort of thing that happens quite often. The bees think about replacing the queen, but in the end they don't. So I'll have a quick look in the bottom brood box. And when I take this super off, because it's got brood in, it may have the queen. I want to be sure that the queen does not fall out or get transferred to another box. So what I will do is take it off and place it on top of the queen excluder, which means that the queen can't escape, she can't fall out through the bottom. And I'll just have a quick look through this glue box. These bees are a bit of a mixture. Some of them are black, some of them have got orange on them, so they're typical mongrels. They vary in colour because of the genetics of bees. The final genetic makeup of each worker is decided by a combination of the queen and several different drones which she mates with. So some of the drones may have more of the Italian strain, the orange, and some will have more of the native, the black bee. So you've got a mixture here of orangey bees and black bees. You can see these bees are beginning to get a bit more excited. At some point in your beekeeping you will come across hives like this. They make a lot of noise, they run around, but touch wood, they're not stinging in particular. And this hive is actually doing very well. It has 4 supers on it now, which is pretty good. So they bring in lots of honey. Now this is interesting. This is where we put super frame in the brood box, and the bees have built below the brood frame. They've built a lot of comb, and that comb is almost entirely drone brood. This is a feature that when they get a chance to build their own comb, they will very often build just drone comb. At one time this was used to control Varroa mites, because it's known that the Varroa mites preferably go for the drone brood for various reasons. So if you had a heavy infestation of Varroa, they would be found mainly in the drone brood. So by putting a frame like this in, you could take off all of the drone brood and basically throw it away, and by that means you would reduce the Varroa. Well, I haven't used this method for a long time for 2 reasons. One is because these days there's very little Varroa in my colonies. I do occasionally treat them, but mostly they have virtually no Varroa, and therefore I've stopped using these methods. The other reason is that it is felt that having drones in the colony is important for their general well-being, their temper and everything else. So we don't use that method anymore. If I opened this colony on a rainy, cold day, I know they would be a great deal worse behaved than they are now. So I always try and do a colony like this on a nice warm day when most of the bees are out, and they tend to be better tempered when the weather is good. There's the queen. She's also got a red mark. So we know this colony is doing alright, and they are not trying to supersede her, because this is one I marked some time ago. So I will now put this hive back together.